I would like to just begin with a quick prayer, if you guys don't mind. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. Thank you, Lord, for this opportunity to learn and to share. I pray that you would make this time fruitful. I pray that you would correct any errors in my thoughts or in speech, that I teach correctly, as we just learned about the importance of informing the ignorant. And I pray that you would enliven in our hearts a deeper love for our fellow neighbor, including those who have challenges with mental health, with neurodivergence that we sometimes have a hard time understanding or maybe having patience for. We pray, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Do we have the clicker? Did Melinda take the clicker? I think we may have lost the clicker. Oh, here we go. Okay, all right. So, okay. So yeah, my name is Mitch Miller. I am a Catholic therapist in West Bend, and I'm from the area here. Moved up to the Twin Cities for my education. Stayed there for about 15 years. Moved back in 2018, and during COVID, well, a group of Catholic therapists started this thing called the Wisconsin Consortium of Catholic Therapists. So that's just a quick and shameless plug. If you guys are looking for a Catholic therapist throughout the state, we have about 50 members statewide, and about half of our members are listed on the website. So you can go to that website if you're looking for more information. Okay, we're going to be talking about neurodivergence, and we're going to be using a lot of different terms. I'm going to be moving through these slides pretty quickly, so if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand, but I will also try to get to the slides quickly so that we can have a chance to get to all the questions at the end. So note on language, neurodivergent versus neurotypical. When I say someone who's neurotypical, I mean someone who has typical neurological functioning. They think, they're wired, their brains and nervous systems work the way that most of our brains and nervous systems work. And then there's this, there's this thing called neurodivergent. And neurodivergent means someone who has a neurodevelopmental disorder. So you can use these terms interchangeably, neurodevelopmental disorder or neurodivergent. The reason why the term neurodivergent is used is because it's an adjective, and so it's used for brevity instead of having to say someone with a neurodevelopmental disorder, which is a bit of a mouthful over and over again. You can just say someone's neurodivergent. It also can avoid pathologizing, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that throughout the talk, the importance of understanding disability versus just difference. Okay, so what are neurodevelopmental disorders? Neurodevelopmental disorders, if we break the word down, we have this neuro part, and that means of or related to the brain and the central nervous system. Then developmental, that means of or related to human development, usually starting in early childhood. So examples of neurodevelopmental disorders include attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, learning disorders, specific learning disorders such as dyscalculia or math learning disability, dyslexia, sensory processing disorders where people have sensations in very different ways from the way most of us. It might be color, sound, texture. And then finally, autism spectrum disorder, which is sort of like a combination of all of these things happening at once. So I'm going to be focusing mostly on autism spectrum disorder because I feel like if you understand autism spectrum disorder, you understand all of these other things, because autism is sort of like a combination. The important thing to know is with neurodevelopmental disorders, our neurons are sort of like the wiring, the hard wiring that connects our body with our brain and the different parts of our brain with each other. And so when we think of a neurodevelopmental disorder, we think of them as people with these disorders as being wired differently or hardwired differently. These are things that don't change generally. It's just the way you're wired. You're not gonna change the neurons, how they're connecting throughout your body. Another important thing to note is that they're often co-occurring. So if you have one of these, many people will have more than one at a time. So you can have dyslexia and ADHD. You can have autism and ADHD. You can have dyslexia and sensory processing disorders. In fact, a very good portion of the time, maybe 30% of the time, people have more than one. And so it's important to realize that when we're talking about neurodevelopment disorders, it's very often that we're talking about more than one at once. And lastly, we're talking about these changes, these differences appearing very young, very often as early as 12 months. Parents and doctors can see that the child is processing information differently, acting differently, behaving differently from stereotyped behaviors of kids of the same age. Okay, a note on mental illness diagnosis. So neurodevelopmental disorders are mental health diagnoses. Very important to know that mental health diagnoses are not like other diagnoses. So if I diagnose you with cancer or with COVID or with something like that, it's because we can do an actual physical lab test and we can see the presence of the virus in the case of COVID or the presence of the cancer in your body. Mental illnesses are not like that. Mental illnesses are sort of like the intersection of all these different things. There's some biological stuff going on, some psychological stuff, some social stuff, some spiritual stuff, and mental illness are sort of like a combination of all these things happening at once. They're descriptive versus etiological. Etiological means causal. So like COVID is an etiological diagnosis. You get the virus causes you to have the symptoms. That is etiological. Descriptive means you're just looking at buckets of symptoms, buckets of traits that you can observe, and that is what a descriptive diagnosis. And so you can see how they're kind of vague. Mental health diagnoses are not as rigorous as a diagnosis of cancer or COVID because we can't look at a physical presence of something. And this is part of what makes it really difficult to diagnose things like autism, which can be very vague. And Melinda told me one of the questions that's on people's mind is, how do you tell neurodivergence versus naughty child? And we'll be talking a little bit more about that later, but it's difficult. It's difficult because it is vague. You can't put someone's brain under a microscope in real time and see, oh, their neurons are doing this, and so they're just being naughty, or this is their autism, they're acting out their autism right now. It's very, very difficult to tell. With experience, someone like me, a therapist who sees a lot of this in a classroom and in other settings, you get a kind of an intuition for what is what. And that's why it can be really important to involve a therapist if you have a child with a neurodivergent condition. They're non-dichotomous, as I said. Many of these things are co-occurring. So if you have an anxiety disorder, there's a very good chance you also have depression, for instance. Or if you have depression, it's very good chance that you have some other disorder. These things often co-occur. And they're very culturally influenced. And so in different cultures, you can see a propensity towards different disorders, which you don't really see with cancer or COVID. It tends to follow pretty predictable patterns worldwide. So in America, we have a higher tendency towards loneliness and anxiety disorders that you wouldn't have if you went to like South America or like Africa or something, just because our culture is different. So that's a big difference between mental illness and other illnesses. Another thing to know about mental illness is sometimes mental illnesses are sort of like extreme variations on a normal functioning thing. And so it's normal, for instance, for everybody to get sad when something bad happens. And, you know, that's we don't feel weird about that. But there are some people who have sadness at unreasonable times that don't make sense, or their sadness is way more intense than what you would expect it to be and lasts way longer. That's when we tend to start seeing mental illness. So that goes back to the vagueness here. And so when we're talking about neurodivergent conditions, there's going to be a lot of things that neurodivergent people do and think that are not completely foreign to us, but the way that they feel it, the way they experience it is on a completely different level. It's so much more intense for them. And so like if you're dealing with a child with autism or something and they're disturbed by a loud noise, well, many of us get disturbed by sudden loud noises. And we might look at that child and think, well, come on, suck it up. You know, you don't have to be so noisy. You don't have to be so disruptive just because of a loud noise. But for them, because they're processing differently, you might not understand just how intense it is. For them, it might be extremely disturbing, and they might need a lot more extra help figuring out how to deal with that disturbance than the average person who is neurotypical would need. Okay, so I'm going to talk about my first experience with autism. I was working at a clinic with, I spent the first 7 years of my career working with the criminal justice system. So I was working in an outpatient clinic with people who were all court ordered for therapy because of criminal behaviors. And so I was seeing this guy who didn't want to see me, and I didn't want to see him, right? We were just kind of stuck with each other. This guy had been coming to this clinic for about a year and a half before I got him. I was the new therapist. I was the baby therapist in training. And other people didn't want to work with this guy. I'll call him Steve, not his real name. No one liked this guy. This guy was obnoxious. He was emotional. He was kind of unpredictable in his emotions. And all the therapists, finally, the therapist didn't want to work with him, so they dumped him on me. And they all told him, like, look out for his manipulation. Look out for how manipulative he can be, all the hyper emotionality, the melodramatic responses. He needs to look at his criminal behavior. He needs to see these things as part of his manipulation and criminal process. And so, operating on that assumption, I worked with this guy, I worked with Steve for probably about almost a year, and we kept butting heads. And I kept challenging him, doing what I was told to do by my superiors. And Steve said, I don't think you're listening to me. I'm trying to tell you this, but you're not listening to me. I'm like, I am listening to you, but you're being manipulative. That's part of your criminal behavior. You need to acknowledge that. We got nowhere. Finally, thank God, but Steve went and he got tested for autism by an expert in autism at the Autism Society of Minnesota. And the testing came back, and the psychologist said, it's clear this guy has autism. There's no question. It's not even close. And I thought about what all my colleagues told me, which was, this guy's not autistic, he's manipulative. And so I was kind of caught between two different opinions. I looked at the testing report, and one of the tests that you do with someone to determine whether they have autism or not is a test of social perception. And so you show them pictures of faces, of lots of different people's faces expressing different emotions. You have a smiley face, you have a frowny face, you have an angry face, and their job is to guess what the emotion is that's being represented. So Steve had a perfect score on the emotional perception. So I went back to psychologists and like, I think you may have gotten this wrong. I looked at the testing, he had a perfect score here. My colleagues tell me that this guy's manipulative. How is it that you can tell me that it's not even close? This guy's definitely autistic. And she said, like, he did get a perfect score. It's not the score that matters. It's how he got his answers. And I'm like, okay, explain this to me. Well, I watched him take the test. That's part of what we're supposed to do. I watched him look at the faces, and he looked at the faces and he sort of analyzed them. And he looked at the eyebrows, looked at the nose, the eyes, the mouth, and he said, I think this is an angry face because this is what the mouth is doing, this is what the eyes are doing, etc. And he was able to get the right answer. It also turns out that Steve has an IQ of over 130. So Steve is very bright. To give you an idea, that's in the top 2 percentile. That's very, very smart. That's almost smart enough to get into Mensa. And so Steve, because he was so smart, had enough raw processing power in his brain to be able to come to the right answers. But he wasn't coming to the right answers the same way you or I would come to the right answers, where you see a happy face and you just say intuitively, oh, that's a happy person, or a frowny face, oh, that's a sad person. He had to analyze it. He had to go through several steps to get there. And he was smart enough to do it. Someone who wasn't that smart wouldn't have been able to get those answers correctly. So there's an important difference. So then I started working with Steve differently. I started saying, okay, you're saying I don't understand you. Help me to understand better. I doubled the frequency of my appointments with him to sometimes twice a week. He was able to get through the program way faster than anybody else, but he needed more attention. He needed me to communicate ideas more clearly. He was misunderstanding me, I was misunderstanding him. And as soon as we understood what the patterns of misunderstanding were, we could adjust our relationship. And by the time he was done, I think he really liked me, and I actually really liked him too. And all of my colleagues were just like, they were flabbergasted. Like, how did this happen? Like, none of them had training in autism, right? These are very senior therapists. Some of them had been working in the field for decades, but none of them had been trained specifically in autism. So you can be a really good, even a mental health professional, and completely miss the boat with these neurodevelopmental conditions. So a few pointers. One, they process differently. Two, they often misunderstand and are misunderstood by others. And four, because of this constant misunderstanding, they're often struggling to compensate. And so that was the headbutting. He was trying really hard to explain to me, and I was trying really hard to explain to him, but we were not getting anywhere. Okay, so a few common misconceptions about autism. One, that autism only happens in children, right? Autism is a hardwiring disorder. It doesn't change. Along with ADHD and all these other disorders that I mentioned before, their neurodevelopmental conditions are not going to change. You learn how to live with them. Two, autistic people lack empathy and compassion. Many autistic people are highly empathic, and sometimes it's disturbing to them because they can see other people's what other people are experiencing, and they feel it so strongly that they can't, maybe even more strongly than the person that they're looking at, and and it's disturbing to them. Number three, all autistic people don't care about friendships or relationships. This is a huge misunderstanding. We'll talk more about this as we keep going. Four, science has conclusively discovered the cause of autism. All right. Autism is a very young disorder. It's constantly undergoing new research. We don't understand it very well. There are some points of it that are well understood, but I'd say probably in the next 100 years, our understanding is going to continue to change a lot. Five, autism is caused by fill in the blank. Vaccines, heavy minerals, gastrointestinal infections. As I said, we don't understand autism very well. So there's probably a whole bunch of different things that contribute to autism, and the jury's still out. We don't have all the answers. And so you're welcome to have lots of different views and opinions about the causes of autism, but currently at this point, if we go by the science, we don't really know the answer for sure. Six, all autistic people have special savant abilities. I'll talk a little bit more of that later. Some autistic people do, many do not. And the opposite, all people with autism are intellectually or cognitively disabled. Also not the case. As I said, with Steve, he had an IQ over 130, so he was very, very bright, but he was constantly compensating for these weaknesses he had. Eight, autism is overdiagnosed. As I said, autism is not very well understood, so it's hard to say whether it's overdiagnosed. In 100 years, we might turn around and say it's actually underdiagnosed. And nine, everyone is somewhere on the autism spectrum. Again, that goes back to the vagueness of mental illness in general. Many of us experience things that are similar to what people on the spectrum do experience, but it's the amount of severity, the intensity of it, and how disruptive it is to our functioning. General estimates on the prevalence of autism, depending on what study you look at, can be around 1% of the population to all the way up to 5% of the population, depending on where you draw your sample from. Okay, all right, brief history of autism. First diagnosis was formulated by an Austrian pediatrician by the name of Leo Kanner in 1943. So this is very, very new, way newer than something like cancer, which we've known about for centuries. And the word autism comes from basically autoism, and it means a high focus on the self. People in autism were thought to be kind of in their own world, separated from the rest of society. And if you think about it, if you're wired differently and you're thinking differently, you are going to have difficulty integrating with other people. And so you see someone with autistic, they very often can be kind of like off in la la land, doing some repetitive behavior over and over and over again. And that was one of the first things that was observed that led them to this diagnosis. They also noticed an extreme preference for solitude, solitary activities. Some of that has to do with how overwhelming they can find social activities, just trying to analyze people's emotions, their intentions. It can be overwhelming and very disturbing. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't like people, but it can be very hard for them to process all that. Two, they notice that there's little interest in skill or social interaction. I mentioned that a little bit. Avoiding eye contact, avoiding physical affection. We talked about some of this. And low verbal skills. That's one of the hallmark characteristics of autism, that starting at a very early age, you are delayed in your ability to speak, your ability to understand and use verbal communication. And then also, he noticed some discomfort extreme discomfort with change. There's a huge preference for routines, predictability in the environment, repetitive motions and behaviors. And anytime there's unpredictability or a deviation from routine, they notice that these kids really, really can't tolerate it. It's very difficult for them. So along with that, they notice that there's these little islands of ability. They might struggle with all of these normal things that we take for granted, but there are just a few things that they're extremely strong at in the midst of all the weaknesses. One thing they noticed is memory. They have very often have very vast memories and can memorize things that other people would have a hard time with. Musical ability tends to be stronger than most people. Keen interest in very specific subjects. If you go to any university with researchers, you will find much higher rates of autism among university professors just because they thrive when they get to really go deep, just learning one kind of thing. Narrow, disconnected interests from broader learning and social engagement. And then five, it's inborn. It's not related to parenting. You can look at twin studies and adoption studies, and the influence of parenting on autism is basically nil. And then there was this guy, Hans Asperger, and he was an Austrian autism researcher, or German, I can't remember. But he found that there were some autistic kids who didn't have all of the impairments, particularly with language and social understanding. There are some that seemed to be pretty high functioning, but had all the other symptoms. And so that's what they came up with, the Asperger's syndrome diagnosis. In the 1950s, the Freudians came up with an interpretation of autism as a form of infantile schizophrenia. And there is some reason for this. People with autism tend to have a very flat affect, just as people with schizophrenia do. They tend to have very poor eye contact and very poor social skills, just like people with schizophrenia do. And very rigid use of language, very literal in their use of language, also like people with schizophrenia. And this was believed by the Freudians to be caused by what quote unquote refrigerator mothers, mothers who were not nurturing, not warm, who were very cold. And they believed that because these women were very cold, these kids developed an infantile or a child with schizophrenia and were not so adequately social. Around this time is when Temple Grandin was born. If you haven't seen the movie Temple Grandin, I strongly recommend it. Very helpful, true story of a woman who was born with autism at a time where they had this refrigerator mother theory of things. So in 1957, her mom was blamed by the doctors. Her mom worked very, very hard to prove that these doctors were wrong and that her daughter could still succeed. At that time, the doctors said, this is basically a death sentence. Your kid's going to be permanently disabled for life and isn't going to amount to anything. But mom worked really, really hard and taught Temple how to use language and interact socially. And Temple went on to become a renowned professor of agriculture and animal husbandry. And her claim to fame is she designed these cattle ranches, in this way of butchering cattle that was more humane and more efficient than anything else that had been used. And about something like 50% of all the cattle ranches in the world are designed using her model. So brilliant mind, incredibly brilliant. Highly recommend watching the movie if you have any interest. So they debunked the schizophrenia hypothesis. They debunked it with a lot of genetic evidence, seeing how autism tends to cluster in family histories. Twin studies debunked it. You could see adoption records, and they say this is genetic. This isn't caused by parenting. They also saw that it's a very, very early onset, like I said before, as early as 12 months, versus with schizophrenia, the onset's in adolescent times. It's unrelated to any environmental factors. So with schizophrenia, there's a lot of environmental factors that affect it, especially things like drug use that can increase the risk of developing schizophrenia. Not the case with autism. And people with autism lack the hallmark characteristics of schizophrenia, and that is hallucinations and delusions. People with schizophrenia, their perceptions are completely cut off from reality. They'll hear voices for people who are not there. They'll see people in their environment that don't exist. With autism, they do have perceptual difficulties. They can see lights that they're really, really sensitive to that other people won't see, or hear sounds they're really, really sensitive that other people won't hear, but they're still connected with reality. if you really dig deep, you'll find that there's something in the environment that's causing them to have these perceptions that actually exists, versus with schizophrenia, these things don't exist. So in the 1980s, they recategorized autism as a neurological disorder. And the theory is it's present from birth, and that's what the current science says. In 2013, the latest edition of the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders clustered autism together with Asperger's and created this new diagnosis called autism spectrum disorder. And that has to do with a lot of the symptoms of autism and Asperger's are so idiosyncratic. It's so unpredictable. You can have symptoms X, Y, and Z, but not symptoms A, B, and C. You can have symptoms L, M, N, O, P, but not X, Y, and Z. And so they said it's more convenient to just cluster them all together under this autism spectrum disorder. So we don't really use the Asperger's diagnosis anymore. More recently, brain imaging research has shown hyper or hypoconnectivity in the brains of people with autism. Their neurons are hyper-connected in certain areas and really weak in other areas. And here's a list of brain regions that are affected: the corpus callosum, which is the part that connects the two hemispheres of the brain to each other; the cerebellum, which is responsible for motor coordination; the default mode network, which has to do with focus and attention; the amygdala, which has to do with fear and threat processing; the prefrontal cortex, which has to do with executive function; the superior temporal sulcus, basal ganglia, striatum, all have to do with motivation and attention; and GABA and serotonin have to do with mood. Again, it's a very heterogeneous diagnosis, very heterogeneous spectrum. You can have, the saying goes, if you meet one person with autism, all you've met is one person with autism. If you meet a second person with autism, they could be completely different in their symptomology than the first person with autism. People who really focus on autism develop an intuition for this, but that's because they've seen not one or two, but like 1 or 200 cases of autism and sort of develop an intuition for the patterns. There's this theory, which is very influential right now, that autism represents a hyper-masculine brain. Stereotyped male traits in the human brain. Human male and female brains are structurally different in some stereotyped ways. And the kind of differences you see between male and female brains are exaggerated in people with autism. So a couple of points with this. The autism ratio is about 1 to 5 female to male. So there's about, for every person who's autistic, there's about 5 autistic boys to every autistic female. So there's a huge skew towards male autism. There's an extreme preference for objects and systems and ideas in personal subjects for people who have autism, versus in female brain patterns, there's a stronger preference for relationships, for people, for emotions, and that's a huge difference between people with autism. It's exaggerated in people with autism. There's this idea of mind blindness that like Steve, extreme difficulty understanding the thoughts and emotions that might be going on in other people's minds. This is thought to be caused by prenatal sex hormones. Exposure to high levels of testosterone, for instance, in utero, can affect the way your brain is wired permanently throughout your entire life. And if you have a lot of testosterone in the pre-utero environment, it's going to cause your brain to have some of these stereotyped male traits in an exaggerated way, even though some of them might turn out to be female. There's a lot of comorbidities with autism. That means co-occurring disorders. I mentioned that word before, I think. Anxiety disorders are really common. Depression, obsessive compulsive disorder. It's very common for people with autism to have gastrointestinal problems, sleep disorders, motor skill problems, coordination problems, autoimmune problems. They can get sick really easily. They can have metabolic problems. They might get diabetes more easily. And they can have problems with muscle and connective tissue. If you meet a lot of people with autism, you might notice that many of them are a little overweight. They're not very athletic. They can be kind of awkward physically and socially. And that's not by accident. A few other co-occurring factors that are important for this population, especially in light of Catholic teaching, is it's very common compared to the general population to see non-heterosexual sexual orientation. So you'll see much in groups of people with autism, you'll see much more of homosexual behaviors, homosexual attractions, bisexuality, and you'll see people who describe themselves as pansexual or even asexual, people who lack any sexual interest at all. And I think a lot of this has to do with kind of like the social understanding, the empathy, the differences in empathy, as well as that those prenatal sex hormones are going to influence a whole lot to do with your sexuality. You see higher rates of gender confusion and gender dysphoria among people with autism, and that's become much more relevant recently. And then you see a lot of prevalence of this alternative identities in general, kind of like fantasy play, role playing, playing around with identities that are not really yours, pretending to be maybe an animal, a cartoon character. Um, and many people with autism feel very comfortable with this because it defines their social expectations in a very rigorous way. Versus if they're just acting like themselves in society, it can feel overwhelming because they don't know how they fit into society. Taking on a role playing type of thing gives them a clearly defined expectation, and they can just sort of live that out, and they feel more comfortable in that. Okay. So very important. Anytime I'm working with someone who I suspect might be autistic or might be on the spectrum, I often recommend testing. And because there's so much overlap between autism and other conditions, it's important to distinguish them from these other conditions. I told the story of Steve and how the autism testing he did with the psychologist was a total game changer in my relationship with Steve. And very often this is the case. Once you understand the patterns of how someone is processing differently, it can completely change your interactions with that person. So things that you need to be able to distinguish from are a mental or intellectual disability, ADHD, willful misbehavior, anxiety and mood disorders, obsessive compulsive related disorders, and personality disorders, especially in adults. People often misinterpret autistic people as being narcissistic, and you can be autistic and narcissistic, but it's not necessarily the case. There's a distinction that needs to happen there. Other complications for diagnosis is this idea of masking or compensation. Many people with autism who are relatively high functioning, such as Steve, who had a really high IQ, learn to sort of try to blend in. They learn to fake it, so to speak. And so they might have very severe autistic symptoms, but because they've learned how to mask it or cover it up, it's harder for people to see, and they just endure a lot of pain and a lot of strife in silence. Um, so an example of this is social grouping. People with autism tend to, birds of a feather flock together. They tend to congregate with other people who also have autism. So their differences don't appear as obvious. They don't have as vast stark a difference from the people around them as they would if they were around neurotypical people. Sometimes these masking functions can be very helpful or functional, such as someone with autism maintaining eye contact by looking at your nose, so that they don't feel so overwhelmed, because making eye contact can be terrifying for people with autism. Looking at the nose can be an adaptive way of masking that, but it can also be dysfunctional. So someone with autism might not understand things like jokes or normal humor, and they might like try to pretend to understand it to blend in. But it can be traumatic because they never understand why they're being picked on or singled out when they don't get the joke or when they make a joke that other people don't think is funny. So it's important for us to understand what it's like to be autistic. General trends can vary widely, and I'm going to try to give you some images here, some metaphors here to help you grasp what it's like for people with autism. The first thing is the idea of mental bandwidth. Neurotypical people have a mental bandwidth which is sort of like a traditional flashlight. And mental bandwidth means your ability to process all of the things happening in your environment at once. And if you think about a flashlight, it sort of gives you this broad beam that illuminates the things pretty close to you. You have fewer blind spots in your immediate environment, but you can't see very far out. You can see maybe a few meters out, and then beyond that, everything's dark. Well, people with autism are sort of like a laser pointer. All right. You have enormous blind spots nearby. You just have this very thin sliver of very intense light, but you have these concentrated areas very, very far out that you can see crystal clear. And this is a huge thing for people with autism who are relatively high functioning, is they can see miles and miles and miles ahead of everybody around them in a really specific topic area, and no one listens to them because no one else can see what they see. I have a client with autism right now who's an engineer, and he got fired from his job because he could see things that were coming down the road with the projects they were doing. He could just see this isn't going to work, and he would try to explain it to them. This is going to lead to this, it's going to lead to this, it's going to lead to this, and then 2 years from now, this is the problem we're going to be dealing with. But they couldn't see it. They said, you don't know that, you can't see the future. But he was right, because he processes in a different way. He's able to see things in this way that other people can't see. But he had a hard time seeing how angry everybody was with him, because he was just insisting, we need to do it this way, need to do it this way, because he could see the disaster coming 2 years down the road that no one else could see, and everybody else had no patience for this guy. So they fired him, which is really sad. The other thing that is different with people who are neurodivergent is this idea of Goldilocks zone. So if you guys remember the story of the three little bears, a Goldilocks breaks into their house, eats their porridge. Mama bear's porridge is too cold, Papa bear's porridge is too hot, and baby bear's porridge is just right, right? That's what we call the Goldilocks zone. You have too much, too little, and just right. And people with, everybody has different comfort zones for stimulation. So this is like a neurotypical person. You have a pretty big zone in the middle of what your comfort zone is. That could be sound, it could be light, it could be temperature, it could be pain. And you're able to function with this amount of stimulation. Anything that happens in this area, you're fine with. It doesn't bother you. As soon as you get above that, it's too much stimulation. You're overloaded. You need everybody to back off and leave you alone and things to calm down. As soon as it goes below this, you're understimulated. You're bored. You feel like you're in a vacuum. You might feel depressed or sad because you're not getting enough stimulation. So this is what most of us live with. With people with neurodevelopmental disorders, it could look like this, right? So you have this huge, this is more like what you would see with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. You have this huge area down here where it's not enough stimulation. And you have this tiny area right in here where it's just right, where your Goldilocks zone is happening. And then anything above that is too much. So it's much, much harder to hit the sweet spot. You are more comfortable with higher levels of stimulation than basically everybody else, but you have a very narrow bandwidth for what is functional for you. It could also look like this, kind of the opposite. You might have this enormous area of comfort, but the topmost part of your area of comfort might be just below the middle of what is comfortable for most of us. And so you need everything to be much calmer. You need everything, you're fine just so long as things are in this big area, and you'd probably be better as something like a librarian or something where things are very predictable. There's not a lot of tension, not a lot of stimulation, and anything above that is going to be too much for you. Okay, and this can vary with different stimuli. So you could have one person who is this with regard to temperature, but they could be this with regard to noise, and vice versa. And they could be this with regard to sound. And this is, most of us, it's this pretty much across the board. But when you talk about neurodivergence, because you have the areas of hypo or hyperconnectivity, it can be difficult to figure out what is causing the disturbance, what type of sensory stimuli are bothering you. So because of these differences, these are some things that people with autism tend to like. They tend to like highly predictable things that they can keep that level of stimulation in a predictable place at all times and not have to deal with the disruption. They tend to like board games and video games. If you hang out with people who play a lot of board games and video games, you will see a lot of people with autism. They like cartoons, they like anime, anything that has a lot of lore, legends, that kind of thing. That area of like that research mind, getting to go really, really, really deep in a single topic, you will find a lot of people with autism in circles that do that stuff. Intense special interests, especially things like math, science, computers, medicine. Anytime you're talking about an object versus a relationship versus a person, People with autism and many mental disorders in that the developmental disabilities um, in, are very comfortable with that. And you'll find some people who are very comfortable with art, things like acting, painting, music. Again, it's about the process or about the object, creating the performance, creating the art piece, rather than relationships that can be very comfortable. They can throw themselves into that and not have to deal with the difficulty of human relationships. Models, Legos, they tend to like bluntness, directness, and honesty because it's more predictable, easier to manage, and anything that's kind of vague can be really difficult for them to grasp. So what they don't like is basically the opposite of all those things. Unexpected changes in plans, unstructured tasks, unstructured social events. Many of them really dislike parties. They might dislike a mass, especially the beginning and end of mass, where things are kind of chaotic, which you guys just had, your sort of post-mass party here. Many people with autism, that'll be overwhelming for them. All right, I'm hearing some laughs. I think you guys get what I'm talking about. Sudden changes, unexpected changes in stimulation, sudden loud noises, sudden flashing lights, textures, smells. So if you see the kid screaming at mass and the priest has just swung the incense around, it could be that the smell is overwhelming to this kid, and they can't tolerate it. And they might not be able to even explain what's going on. All they know is it's really disturbing. They don't like indirect communication, insinuations. Just tell me what you mean. Tell me literally. I do better with literal communication than innuendo. And they tend to not do very well with team sports and group projects. Again, that idea of autoism, self-focus. Oops. Oh, okay. So is it a disability or is it a normal human difference? So some famous people, Elon Musk, confirmed autism. He had the testing done. He's gone public with it. He is autistic. Anthony Hopkins, confirmed case. He has autism. He's gone public with this. Dan Aykroyd from the Blues Brothers has autism. He's gone public. Elfriede Jelinek, she is a Nobel Prize winning laureate in literature. She has gone public. She has autism. Of course, Temple Grandin. And then several sort of speculative cases. Steve Jobs probably had autism. Albert Einstein probably had autism. Isaac Newton probably had autism. And our very own Thomas Aquinas probably had autism. So there's a good reason to think of this as a disability. One, it's very difficult for the person with the disorder to function and do the normal tasks of a human being, difficult for them to maintain relationships, difficult for them to fit in normal social settings. So because of this, those of us who have someone in our lives who has autism, this can cause wear and tear on us, all right? So there needs to be a balance between helping yourself and helping the other person. You need to pace yourself. You're not going to fix their autism. You have to take care of yourself so that you can be in it for the long haul. You need to be able to distinguish willfulness from autistic distress. And that's the idea of the naughty child versus the neurodivergent child. And this might take years of patience and listening and understanding, consultation with a therapist or other expert in autism like myself or a coach or a teacher. And you have to constantly be pushing the person with autism to stretch outside of their comfort zone, because otherwise they will retreat in their very, very small Goldilocks zone. And that Goldilocks zone may be so small that they won't be able to function as a normal human life. Things to avoid. You don't want to be overly enabling. I think the Temple Grandin movie does a really good job of explaining this. The mother's constantly pushing her daughter to use language, to use words to describe things versus just pointing and mumbling, to engage with people, to have relationships, to try giving people hugs, to try giving handshakes, and get used to that normal social contact, even though for Temple it was extremely hard. And if you watch the movie, you will see that. You don't want to coddle the disordered behavior and patterns, and you don't want to protect them from natural consequences. I have a client right now who's a mother of a daughter with pretty severe autism, and she does not want to do schoolwork. She does not want to get a job. She's at 19 years old, and she's at that age where she should be adjusting to adult life, but she just wants to stay in her room all day long in her little comfort zone. And mom has to try to kind of balance this thing between understanding the struggle, but also not coddling or protecting her from the natural consequences of things like losing jobs for not showing up to work on time. If you protect too much, you will be reinforcing the negative behaviors. But you also don't want to be overly punitive. You want to make an effort to understand their experience, because just like me and Steve, I was butting heads with Steve for like a year. It got us nowhere. So you don't want to be too harsh, too critical. You don't want to be demeaning, degrading, or unrealistic. And very often this can really help a lot of to have testing so that you understand what their patterns are. Oh, this is what disturbs you. Okay, so this is what I can expect from you. I shouldn't be able to expect you to deal with these kinds of noises, these kinds of social situations, because you just can't function in those situations. You simply can't. You don't have the ability. Okay, treatments for autism. I have this quote here. This is a picture of a Shiba Inu, and I love this quote. It's from dogster.com. It says, Shiba Inus are known to bolt on a whim, and no amount of obedience training will ever change that. Okay, so this is a good model for autism. There's no amount of training that's ever going to change their underlying characteristics. Just like the Shiba Inu here, they're always going to have those tendencies. You're not gonna beat that out of them, no matter how much you try to change them. But that said, there are several different options for treatment for autism, and they can be effective at treating some of the symptoms, though not all of them. There is no effective treatment for all symptoms of autism. And like I said, they don't change the underlying structures. Okay. The first treatment, the broadest, is applied behavior analysis. It's very complicated. It's based on the behavioral principles of positive and negative reinforcement. So think of Ian Pavlov, the dog and the meat powder, rewards and punishments, that kind of thing. It's pretty comprehensive. It can address most of the manifestations of autism, and it's overall moderately effective. It's very broadly applied, but many people with autism find it harsh and punitive, because it's all about these rewards and punishments, these consequences, trying to make the behaviors more or less likely to occur. And there's probably the most practitioners of this available of any of the different kinds of treatments for autism, and it should be taken seriously. Then there's this other thing. It's a newer application called the Early Start Denver model, and it's based on the same ideas of conditioning, positive and negative reinforcement, that applied behavior analysis is based on. But it's really only going to work with very, very young kids, with children ages about 1 to 2 years old. And so it's very important, if you want to get this, to pick it up on the autism very, very early so you can benefit from this treatment. It's extremely effective compared to other treatments, but not everybody has the advantage of being able to use it this early. And it involves a lot of play therapy, building relationship skills through games, language skills, motor skills, cognitive skills through enjoyable activities. But you have to catch it early. Okay. Speech therapy is often used for people with autism to practice their verbal and nonverbal communication. It encourages and improves communication skills, but it doesn't address the other issues of autism. And people with autism, it's only going to be as good as they actually use the skills that they're being taught. Occupational therapy is often used for people with autism. I have a friend who's an occupational therapist who works at a school with only autistic children. And there they work with fine motor skills, coping skills for addressing emotional and sensory overload, communication needs, and organizing and managing daily tasks of living. Then there's social skills training, which often is done in groups of kids, oftentimes with groups of kids with autism and sometimes some without autism. And sometimes this is videotaped, and then the children are allowed to watch the videotapes, and then they can see and analyze, oh, this is how I responded in this situation. This is how people saw me, how I came across. I came across as overbearing or demanding. I didn't mean to come across as overbearing or demanding. What I meant to come across was I just wanted people to understand what I was trying to say. So breaking things down again in that sort of analytical process can be very helpful for people with autism. And having video recordings allows them to review it over and over and over again until they understand the patterns. That's very common for people with autism to need a lot of repetition before they get concepts that many of us would take for granted after one or two explanations. Other treatments that are helpful, often people use medications such as stimulants or anti-anxiety medications to help keep them in their Goldilocks zone, but they only manage specific symptoms. They don't get rid of the problem. Parent coaching and training, such as when a parent sees a therapist like me to help with training on autism, that helps. Art, music, and play therapies are also very, very helpful. Especially with young children. There's this thing called biofeedback and neurofeedback where they hook you up to heart scanners and brain scanners, and they figure out what sort of brain waves are going on, what your heart rate is doing, and they train you to kind of keep your brain waves and your heart rate in that Goldilocks zone, so to speak. And that can be very helpful, but there's not a lot of people around who do that. And then there's this thing called integrative and functional medicine, which tries to treat disorders by looking at underlying nutritional deficiencies or toxicities or allergies. And that there's some evidence that that can be helpful too, especially when you're talking about the gastrointestinal problems that people with autism tend to have. So how does our faith apply to this? Well, it's important for us to treat everybody a little bit differently because everybody's going to understand and receive love differently. And so St. Therese of Lisieux, if every tiny flower wanted to be a rose, spring would lose its loveliness. So autistic people and neurodivergent people are a different kind of flower, right? They bring something different. And so it might cause friction at times, but it's important for us to understand that that's part of the beauty of the church. There's another from an Eastern saint. Everyone has his own gift from God, one way in this and another in that, right? I think we all know people in our own lives who are like this. And then from the Catechism, imputability and responsibility for an action can be diminished or even nullified by psychological or social factors. So again, that not autism versus naughty child, we have to be very cautious about being quick to put judgment on someone who might be reacting in different ways because of psychological factors. It's important for us to remember that we live in a fallen world. People are born with all kinds of conditions through no fault of their parents, through no fault of their own. And we have to be forgiving. We can't be the first to cast a stone. We have to carry our cross and sometimes endure the frustration and friction that comes with having loved ones and people in your church community that have these neurodevelopmental conditions. Here's a picture of St. Damien Molokai, who was a saint who ministered to lepers, and he was so giving of himself that he eventually developed leprosy and he died from it. A beautiful saint. I encourage you to look up his story. And I'm not saying that we should, one, you're not going to catch autism by hanging around with people with autism, right? Right. But you should be willing to try to absorb as much friction as you can because there's going to be friction. They're wired differently. They're not going to see things differently. It's not your fault if you end up butting heads. It wasn't my fault that I was butting heads with Steve at the beginning of this presentation. I was doing what I was taught and I was doing what I thought was the right thing. That's going to happen with you if you're interacting with people with autism. There's going to be some head butting. It's not your fault. It's not their fault, but you should try to learn from it. It's not necessarily that the case that every single difference because of autism or neurodivergence is a problem to be solved. They took the man born blind to Jesus and they asked him, why is this man born blind? Was it him who sinned or was it his parents who sinned? And Jesus said, you guys are missing the point, right? He wasn't born blind because of sin. He was born blind to make the glory of God known. And sometimes people have these differences and sometimes very difficult differences, not because they're a problem to be solved, but because God wants to show through us how awesome his love is, that it can overcome even these differences. That's the kind of selfless generosity we're cared to. And then finally, there's a big importance for professional assessment and diagnosis. And be careful because nowadays it can be fashionable for some young people to say they're autistic when they're not really autistic, or to say that they're neurodivergent when they're not. We don't want to be enabling. We don't want this to be an abuse of charity, for them to take advantage of people and claim to be, oh, you can't hold me to this expectation. You can't hold me to this behavioral rule because I have autism. Very important that you consult a professional to make those distinctions, because it can be really disastrous in the long term if you're reinforcing the wrong thing. Another thing that has to do with our faith, many people with autism tend towards atheism. And I suspect that this has to do with their discomfort with vagueness, their discomfort with contradictions. They want things to be very rigid and predictable, and they're more comfortable with things that are quantifiable, like science. I suspect that Richard Dawkins himself probably is on the autism spectrum. If you look at how he reacts to people, the level of anger he gets in conversations with people, it's above and beyond what you would expect of most people in most circumstances. I suspect he's on the autism spectrum. um, and difficulty with social integration. Religions are incredibly social things. There's among the most social thing that human beings do. And for people on the autism spectrum and people with neurodivergent broadly, integrating with these communities is really hard. And so if you feel hurt by a social community, such as a church, because you are not understood and don't understand them, very often there's a tendency to go the opposite direction. And you might find comfort or solace in an online gaming community or something like that, where people will tend to have negative attitudes and negative memories and experiences of religious communities. So it's very important for us to be aware of this. There's a good book that touches on this by Paul Vitz, called The Faith of the Fatherless and the Psychology of Atheism. We need to be mindful of this thing called countertransference. Sometimes the things that irritate us most about others is the parts of ourselves that they remind us of. And so if we see someone with autism who's acting out in a certain way and we're getting especially angry, especially impatient with them, it's important for us to do the hard work of looking in the mirror and figure out, why is this causing me to have such a strong reaction, so that you are more free and open to show them Christ's love, and you don't have that hang up, you don't have that blockage. So very often when I'm working with parents of children with this is a huge part of the work, is looking at this countertransference. I'm really mad at my kid because my kid gets super anxious and disruptive in this situation, in this situation. Okay, what does that remind you of? Oh, that reminds me of my own struggles with anxiety and how people judge me for my anxious responses. And I don't want them to be judged the same way I was. Okay, you need to work out your own baggage before you're going to be able to help your kid. You need to take the wooden beam out of your eye before you try to pluck the splinter out of your neighbor's eye. Okay. All right. So that's the slideshow. Pop quiz, true or false? Scientists have discovered the cause of autism spectrum disorder. How many people think true? How many people think false? Yes, thank you. True or false? There are many scientifically validated treatments that are highly effective in treating most autism spectrum disorder symptoms. How many people think true? How many people think false? Okay, wonderful. People tend to outgrow autism spectrum symptoms as they get older. How many people think true? How many people think false? Thank you. It is important to distinguish willful misbehavior from reactions to sensory distress in autism spectrum disorder for all ages. How many people think true? How many people think false? Awesome. Autism spectrum disorder can often be confused with other conditions, including obsessive compulsive disorder, antisocial personality, and narcissistic personality disorders. How many people think true? How many people think false? Excellent. People with autism tend to be misunderstood by others, but are usually pretty good at understanding others. How many people think true? How many people think false? Okay, yes, this is true. You do sometimes see people who are very good at understanding one very specific area. Like you might have someone who's really good at understanding when someone else is confused or when someone else is anxious or something, but they lack the sort of broad spectrum of understanding that most of us take for granted. Okay, raising a child with autism is usually easy, and parents shouldn't need special support or accommodation? How many people think true? How many people think false? Okay, good. And lastly, autism spectrum disorder bears little in common with other neurodevelopment disorders like ADHD, dyslexia, or sensory processing disorders. Little in common. How many people think true? How many people think false? Okay, yes, it's false. Okay, awesome. All right, thank you. That's it. Any questions? Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not an expert in testing, but they would, I can tell you in the general schema of things, what they're looking at is if you had children recently and you go to the doctor, they'll be able to tell you what percentile your kid is in terms of height, in terms of weight, in terms of this, that, or the other thing. And when you go for psychological testing for any age, they're going to be looking at specific behaviors and they're going to try and quantify those behaviors versus on percentile. So they'll say, how many words does your kid recognize or understand? And so by a certain age, there's a certain number of words that even though they might not be able to verbalize them, might not be able to write or anything, but they will respond to, even a dog you can tell when a dog understands sit, come, that kind of thing. Even infants show these sort of very subtle reactions to words, for instance. Faces, you can show babies pictures of faces, videos of faces, and they'll respond in stereotyped ways. And if you get X, Y, or Z number of responses, you can then categorize them. Where are they on the bell curve compared to similar age peers? I don't know what the exact tests are, but that would be the general principles that they use. Thank you. Other questions? Yeah. Absolutely. Yes. It's very, very genetic. In fact, twin studies are very, very helpful with this. If you see identical twins that are separated at birth, one of them is adopted, one of them is adopted by a different place, you can see that there's very, very high correlations, basically perfect correlations with those situations. A parent with autism is something like, I think it's like 20 times more likely to have a child with autism than a parent who doesn't have autism. It's very, very high. And so if you have a base rate of autism around 1% of the population, and let's say you're getting married and you are having a baby, your chances of having a baby with autism, especially if it's a male child, um, are going to be probably 10 to 20 times that 1%. So you have like a 1 in 5 chance of having your kid with autism, something like that. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah. Yeah, I'm not an expert in exactly that, but I worked for the first 7 years of my career with people coming out of the prison system, in the halfway house system. And yeah, I haven't done exactly that, but I've led groups, and it can be very important for people to like understand like, oh, this is how you people think. I don't think that way. This is how I think. And very often, probation officers, correctional officers, law enforcement don't have adequate training to identify that and to understand that, which leads to sometimes very, very egregious and serious misunderstandings that can lead to. I mean, if you're dealing with someone who's grew up in a gangland environment where violence was used to solve most problems, it can end in violence and sometimes even death for people. So this can be a life or death thing, just to be able to have people understand each other, understand you process this differently than I do. How do we make this work then? Okay, any other questions? Yeah. Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is you probably want to consult with an expert in autism, a therapist, a doctor, a psychologist, or a teacher. You want someone who can either do some testing or someone who's seen so many cases of autism that they can kind of sort of have an intuitive grasp on it. And then you want that person to walk you through finding um, what the Goldilocks zone is for your granddaughter, where her areas of comfort in functioning are, and where her areas of discomfort, where does things get to be not enough stimulation, where do things get to be too much stimulation, and learning how to interact with her in ways that are in her Goldilocks zone, because you might be comfortable with this level of stimulation and she might only be comfortable with like this level of stimulation. And that might be different in when we're talking about light or sound or pain or, you know, nonverbal communication. She might feel at this level that you're comfortable with completely overwhelmed. Or the opposite, she might be comfortable up here and down here. She can't pay attention to you because she's bored, right? Not enough stimulation. Yeah. I hope that answers your question. Yeah. Bingo. Yeah. Perfect. Any other questions? Well, currently the closest thing that exists to a comprehensive resource would be the public school system. And the public school system is not excellent at it. Yeah, I mean this is a new disorder. It's only been around since 1943. It's going to probably take another 100 years before like the general knowledge kind of catches up. Um, uh, it's hard to find people. It's hard to find people. This is one of the reasons why we created this to make it easier to identify people who have the expertise, who are respecting and practicing the faith. But I'm going to be honest with you. There's not a lot of people out there, and there's a huge need in case any of you have children who are interested in psychology or the human helping professions. There's a huge need in these areas, and it's going to only continue to grow with years. So the answer is very with a lot of difficulty. It's not easy. I think I saw another hand somewhere. Maybe answered the question. Okay. I'd like to wrap up with a prayer. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Thank you, Lord, for the privilege that you've given us to believe in you and to follow you. I pray that you would make this information fruitful and continue to sink deep and grow our love for a fellow neighbor and our love for you and our awe for you, that you love all of us despite so many differences, so many difficulties. I pray that you would inspire in us that kind of love, that sort of self-sacrificial love. I also pray that you would be with each one of us, especially those of us who have loved ones with these conditions, that you would help us take care of ourselves and pace ourselves and not have unrealistic expectations of our abilities to live up to the standard of your love. Um, as we pray, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Right. Thanks, everybody.